Okay, go ahead.
So that's a good question. What was life like for a black child living in Washington, D.C., particularly in Wards 7 and 8, and a few other quadrants of the city? But it wasn't very good because you were considered living east of the Anacostia River. So when they say over the river, those are the areas that they're actually talking about. It was pretty rough at that time. You know, you had a lot of parents, single parent homes. You had some homes that had both parents in them, but they were working people, such as the one I lived in. My mother was a worker. 2 weeks she would work from like 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. And then the next 2 weeks she would work like 4 p.m. till midnight. So, of course, you had the older children that looked out for the younger ones, as well as some neighbors and that sort of thing. But one of the things that was good, we didn't have much, but you did have recreation centers where some kids could go and spend time in the evenings doing homework and, you know, other activities, sports, and that sort of thing. But for some, it was, you know, just straight home and not a lot to do. So that's kind of what it was like. You know, it was a struggle for the families. I can certainly tell you that. And growing up in public housing certainly was no picnic. But, you know, we didn't really think that we were poor. I mean, we knew that we couldn't get what we want if we asked for it from our parents all the time. But, you know, times were, I'll put it this way. I can remember having to walk to school because that's what you did. And if you only had one pair of shoes, you wore that same pair of shoes literally every day, or you did wear them every day. And you wore them to the point where there were holes in the bottom of them. And I remember having to stick newspaper into my shoes, and particularly on a rainy day, put newspaper there and then fold up additional papers so that when I did arrive at school after walking, of course, my feet were wet and so forth, I could pull that paper out, stick a new piece in, continue my day. So that was what it was about. But I can tell you this, there were not a lot of opportunities around for young black kids. You know, we did what we could. We delivered flyers for supermarkets, shoveled snow in the wintertime to make a few dollars. We worked in the summer months. We got a summer job. Started out as sort of like courtesy patrol, that's patrolling in your community with orange shirts and orange hats. And, you know, we were paid. I remember making like every 2 weeks, you got a check for about $67 and some change, which was really, really good for 2 weeks. That's what life was about. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Tatiana and I have been working on this case for roughly 21 months. We began researching it separately when one day the case randomly surfaced in a conversation. With both of us drawn to true crime, this case was compelling to say the least. A serial killer from our backyard, whom we both had never heard a word about. We had to get answers.
It just seemed too coincidental that we both had been looking into the case. And the fact that to this day, these types of cases are pretty much glossed over or never solved because of the profile of the victims.
The Freeway Phantom case felt incredibly personal, and it pulls at our heartstrings. There were so many parallels with the victims and the people in our lives, coupled with the fact that this case is just like so many others that go cold in this area. Little black girl found missing or dead, minimum news coverage. Then, after a couple of weeks, it's lost and forgotten. Rinse and repeat.
In this area, brown girls go missing in ridiculous amounts. In 2017, within a 24-hour period, 14 African American girls went missing. Relisha Rudd, a significant missing persons case in this area, involved an 8-year-old girl who disappeared with a former janitor in her homeless shelter.
So we decided to put time into researching these murders. Just the two of us, pulling any and every resource we could, giving the story a chance to be heard. And there wasn't much to start with, but what we were able to piece together was a chilling story of a sick individual who is still at large.
April 1971 was the start of a heartbreaking murder spree that would leave a number of different families hopeless and a city terrified. The Washington, D.C. area was terrorized by the freeway phantom for a 16-month span where he raped, beat, and strangled and killed multiple young girls, afterwards tossing them on the side of various highways and freeways throughout the area. Most people who are not from the Washington, D.C. area don't know this, but the D.C. metropolitan area, or simply known as the DMV, is pretty unique. The acronym DMV stands for D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. It encompasses all of Washington, D.C. and various counties from Maryland and Northern Virginia. These areas are extremely close to one another. To paint a picture for you, driving time can end up being 10 to 15 minutes from Maryland to D.C., or it can take 10 to 30 minutes to get to Northern Virginia from D.C. or Maryland, all depending on which area you are coming from or going to. Hence the name DMV. Basically, it all just seems like one state. To give you an idea of what life was like for a Black person in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Washington, D.C. is divided into 4 quadrants: Northwest, Southwest, Northeast, and Southeast. Naturally, Black people lived all over the city in each of these quadrants. Yet, during that time, the Northwest section of the district was more densely populated with Black people. Let's listen to Michael and Stephanie Green, both Washingtonians, speak on Washington, D.C. culture in the 1960s and 1970s.
It's so interesting how in the 60s and 70s, the shift with how many white families were living over in Anacostia, and how things just really evolved over a period of time. Back in years ago, when my father was growing up and a young adult, Blacks were predominantly in Georgetown.
Yeah. And one of the big dividing lines, as we mentioned, was Rock Creek Park. So if you lived east of Rock Creek Park, most of your Black folks lived east of Rock Creek Park. And that would be from mostly 14th Street going east. On the other side of Rock Creek Park, you had Ward 3, and that's Northwest Washington, and that was mostly populated by white families, and that was going west. So that was a big dividing line. It always has been and still is today.
Washington, D.C. circa 1971 was a changing city. The demographics were shifting to a larger population of Blacks. After reviewing the census, the overall population in the city decreased by tens of thousands year after year from the 1950s to the 1970s. Meanwhile, the population of Blacks continued to rise during the span of the 1950s to the 1990s, and the white population steadily declined over those decades. As the district government began to develop more housing projects for low-income families, more Blacks moved to parts of Northeast, Southeast, and Southwest. Southeast quickly changed from a predominantly white quadrant to a primarily Black section of the city, otherwise known as white flight. White flight is defined as the phenomenon of white people moving out of urban areas, particularly those with significant minority populations, and into suburban areas. Here is Miss Levitha Long, a native Washingtonian, speaking on Washington, D.C. culture.
You had a mixed neighborhood. You had people who were homeowners. You had your homeowners, and then you had the people, just because they were low income or poor, they weren't of that mindset where they didn't want any better. During that time, they had this idea, well, people have rights. Old parent mothers have rights. And it was a big thing with Marion Barry. I'll never forget it. This woman had all these children, just kept having children, but this one, that, and the other one, to get a bigger check. And they weren't being supervised or monitored. Up until, I'll say, the mid-60s, you had social workers from the schools. They monitor your kids' comings and going, where they cleaned, they checked their hair to see if they had headlights or ringworms. They made sure they had their shots. They made sure their teeth were checked. They had in-school dental care. If you had glasses, they had an eye bank, someplace where you can go get glasses. They had a shoe bank for these shoes. And they monitored to see what you were doing and how you were functioning in your home. And you couldn't be on the street because they were enforcing a curfew. When all of that went out the window, after the riots, well, we got more rights, and they just let them do whatever they wanted to do. It was nothing like that prior to that time. After that, it was just like projects looked like projects. Public housing, Condon Terrace, what a lot of people don't realize, Condon Terrace was not predominant, it was a white project, white public housing.
Since the beginning of this investigation, we've asked several people hailing from numerous areas nationwide if they have ever heard of the Freeway Phantom murder case. Surprisingly, many people have never heard of the case, but if they did have any knowledge, they were usually fuzzy on the details. The responses vary from, wasn't that the case where girls were being kidnapped because they were named Denise? Or, yeah, isn't that the case where a couple of the girls were murdered and they just caught the guy a few years ago? The suspect was never apprehended. In fact, the case is still cold and one of the largest cold cases in the history of Washington, D.C.
No, can't say I have. The only kind of murder case that I remember, I was born in 85, was the park jogger serial killer in D.C., and that's really all I remember.
Born and raised here, and I've never heard of anything like that.
No, I haven't. I have not.
I have heard of the Freeway Phantom murder case, but I can't remember all of the specifics and details.
No, I've never heard anything about it.
No, I've never heard of that case.
While the Freeway Phantom case remains relatively unknown to most, another murder mystery case from the 1970s is more prominent. The case I'm speaking of is the Lyon sisters case. Sheila and Catherine Lyon were sisters who disappeared on March 25, 1975, as they traveled to Wheaton Plaza in Wheaton, Maryland, which is located in Montgomery County about 20 minutes from the district line. The main difference in the case of the Lyon sisters versus the Freeway Phantom case was the race. The Lyon sisters were two white girls. Let's hear if people were able to recall this case.
Is that the one with the two sisters, something they got kidnapped or something like that, murdered at Wheaton Mall or Wheaton Plaza at the time?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I remember a little bit about it.
Yes, I did hear about that. Those were the two girls that got missing from Wheaton Mall? Mm-hmm. Yes.
I feel like that does ring a bell, but no, I can't recall like off the top of my head what it would be.
The two girls who were missing at what do I want to call that? They were supposed to have been walking home from the store or something, and I heard about last year that they were bringing up the case again. It was a cold case. They never did find out, but I hear that now, after this many years, that people are starting to talk.
The media continued to revisit the Lyon sisters case every few years, constantly reminding us of the unfortunate details surrounding it, until it was solved in 2015 when Lloyd Welch was indicted for the kidnapping and murder of the girls. He eventually pled guilty in 2017. Welch was already serving a lengthy sentence for child abuse in Delaware. You don't hear much about the Freeway Phantom case, not in this area or any other place. Googling it doesn't generate much success either. A few articles will appear on the search list, but the same information is repeated. The typical reward poster with a picture of each of the 6 victims. Other than that, the information available for this case is very limited. However, although many of the family members of the victims and detectives assigned to this case are deceased, there are still some people who carry this case in their hearts 40 plus years later. Romaine Jenkins is one of those people. Her undeniable passion for this case, coupled with her razor-sharp mind, you could ask Romaine anything about this case and she can recall the exact details or events. At 76 years old, it seems as if she still knows her case files front to back. Romaine has a maternal air about her, very nurturing and kind, mixed with her no-nonsense attitude. She commands respect without saying much. Nevertheless, once you begin a conversation with her, she will have you hanging on to her every word. It's captivating to say the least. The year was 1971, and Romaine Jenkins was 28 years old, albeit a young and ambitious woman navigating through a white male-dominated career field. However, this doesn't stop Romaine from soaring and achieving her goals. She becomes the first female Metropolitan Police homicide detective, which at this time was a huge deal.
I was the first female detective in the homicide unit.
Okay.
I went to homicide in 1968 during the time of the riot.
Congratulations. That's a huge accomplishment. So
Thank you.
at that time, like when you look at the police department, was it mostly white? Was it mostly black? Was it half and half? Like, what were the demographics on the police department for the Metropolitan Washington, D.C. Police Department?
Well, I would say probably mostly white. There weren't a lot of females at the time. They had started hiring females, but when I joined the police department in 1965, police women had to have a college degree in psychology, sociology, or have been a registered nurse, whereas the men only had to have a high school diploma.
Jenkins wasn't the original detective assigned to the freeway case. In fact, 2 other detectives led the case, but Jenkins quickly familiarized herself with every victim. Carol Denise Spinks was a 13-year-old girl from Southeast D.C. Petite and standing at a mere 5 foot even, she was shy, quiet, and very reserved. You could find her hula hooping or double dutching with friends. She was one of 8 children with an identical twin sister, Carolyn. Her mother, Alantine, was a single mother and undoubtedly known as a strict disciplinarian. On the evening of Sunday, April 25th, 1971, Carol was sent to the store by her 24-year-old sister, Valerie, who lived across the hall in the same apartment complex. Valerie managed to convince Carol into walking to the 7-Eleven for a few groceries. They lived in an apartment building on Waller Place in Southeast D.C. The 7-Eleven was located just across the D.C.-Maryland line, which is about 4 blocks away. Carol had made this walk many times before. What could go wrong? Once Carol began walking to the store, her mother saw her as she drove past. Alantine was returning to the neighborhood after visiting her sister in Brentwood, Maryland. She stopped the car and told Carol that she would receive her punishment when she returned from the store, but let Carol continue on her errand. Carol made it to the 7-Eleven, purchasing the items she was sent for: TV dinners, bread, and a soda that her big sister Valerie told her to get for herself as a reward for going to the store. Carol left the store with the items. Those same items were found on a sidewalk near the 7-Eleven. Carol, however, was never seen again.
We're here at Waller Place and Wheeler Road at the intersection. And so where we're standing, Carol's house, where she lived, her apartment, is about a block down the street. And her walk to the 7-Eleven would have been, what, like 10 minutes?
Yeah. It seems busy enough out here that somebody, well, plenty of people would have been out here.
Yeah, for sure.
And we know for a fact that back then even, it was a pretty busy street.
Where we're standing at this intersection, we're just trying to track her walk to the 7-Eleven, and we're feeling like she would have just walked up, on Waller Place, and then she would have hit this intersection at Wheeler Road and Waller Place and went up another block to continue on to go to the 7-Eleven that was located on Wheeler Road, which, she never made it back. So I'm just curious to know where Alantine saw her. Where did Alantine stop her?
I mean, it couldn't have been too far from here. It's like a hop, skip, and a jump. And then if you're in a car, that's no time. But she's coming down this way.
Exactly. So, I mean, again, it was like a walk that she probably did many times. That's why Valerie asked her to do it, because she's done it before. She was trustworthy. Right. She could handle it.
And her mother even let her continue going after she spotted her.
So just thinking about like a 12-year-old going to the convenience store at that time, 1971, of course, that's totally different compared to now. Like now you may have more reservation about sending a 12-year-old by themselves to the store on an errand like that, just because of all the things that could happen. And not to say those things didn't happen at that time in 1971 in DC. However, you just think that, like, I've talked to people that, grew up in the city and, grew up during that time. And, they've all said, oh, it was safe to do this. It was safe to do that. We didn't have to worry about you traveling, walking on foot. Like, those things really didn't happen like that. It was just overall a safer culture.
Yeah, I feel like just in general, back in those times, everywhere you could do way more than what you could do now. You see how the times change over the years and how things just get worse and worse. Crime gets crazier and crazier. The news gets wilder and wilder. So, I understand that.
Yeah, and just thinking about, okay, we're both mothers, and I just tried to put myself in Allentene's position at that time. Like, you're a strict disciplinarian, single mom, you're doing it on your own. Luckily you have the older sibling who lives across the hall who could watch the younger siblings while, you're in Brentwood, which Brentwood is about, like a half hour or so, I believe, away from like that part of Southeast. So, maybe it's just like slightly longer, but, just thinking about like putting myself in her position, like, okay, I see my daughter walking home after I told her not to go to the store, and of course being furious. Right. But then so I was just like thinking like, wow, like I know that haunts her, the fact that she didn't say get in the car.
Yeah, like that's
like get in the car and let's go home. Like she let her continue on that errand and she never saw her daughter again. Like I can't imagine. Like literally I can't.
And then even the guilt that the sister must have,
Right, Valerie. Because she told her to go to the store.
Right.
On the next episode of Somebody's Watching.
The roll off, you see all the marches and all the hell they raised about what went on. Because when Carol Spinks was missing, the neighborhood turned out. The neighborhood turned out looking for her because they all knew one thing. Mrs. Spinks did not allow her kids to run the street. They all knew that. So if Carol is missing, it's not right. What?
If you have any tips regarding the Freeway Phantom case, please call 202-656-5299 or visit the website www.somebodieswatchingpodcast.com.